dreams can be a powerful thing. I think nobody knows that better than Jacob's youngest son, Joseph. Now, everybody has dreams. Even if you think you don't dream, you actually do. You have dreams every time you go into REM sleep. People who don't think they dream usually just don't remember them. Within 5 minutes of waking up, you forget about half of what you have dreamt about during the night. And within 10 minutes, you usually forget about 90% of it. Even people who are blind dream. If a person was blinded at some point after they were born, they will continue to have dreams that's full of imagery. And if a person is blind from birth, they will still have dreams, but instead of there being sight and visions in them, they will dream about things that they can smell or hear or touch. All the other senses are involved in their dreams. The few people who don't dream usually have serious psychological disorders. Strange as this might sound, we really only dream about what we know. Our dreams are frequently full of strangers who play certain parts, but did you know that your mind isn't inventing those faces? Every person that you've ever seen in a dream is actually someone that you have seen in real life. They share a face with someone you've seen in real life. They are the real faces of real people, but you just simply don't remember them. The evil killer in your last nightmare may have had the same face as the cashier in the grocery store where you went as a little kid, and you simply don't remember that person. Having seen hundreds of thousands of faces over the course of a lifetime, our brains have endless supply of characters for our brain to utilize during our dreams. Not all of us dream in full color. About 12% of normal-sighted people actually dream exclusively in black and white. And the older you are, the more likely you are to dream in black and white. 60 years ago, it was more like a third of all people dreamt in black and white. But people who are 25 and under, it's more like 4%. So it's strange. Our dreams, the same thing is happening that happened to our televisions. We're dreaming less and less in black and white. Most people will have between 4 and 7 dreams per night. And men dream differently than women. Men tend to dream more about other men. Studies suggest that about 70% of the characters in the average man's dream are other men. Whereas women tend to dream about men and women in equal numbers. Studies measuring brain waves have shown that our brains are more active when dreaming than they are when we're awake. But don't take that to be permission to nod off right now. I bet that every one of us has been affected by our dreams in some way at some time, in big ways or small. But many people have had their lives completely changed by their dreams. Joseph was such a person. He was the favorite son of a shepherd who, because of his dreams and the way that those affected his life, he became a slave. And once he was a slave, because of his dreams, this is the last part of the story, but because of his dreams, he went from being a slave to being one of the highest government officials in all of Egypt. And ultimately, as he grew along the way, his special dreams went from being a curse to being a blessing. Here's how it happened. Joseph's father, Jacob, had a number of sons. But Joseph, the youngest son, was the favorite. He was the fair-haired son. And Jacob liked to lavish Joseph with all manner of special gifts, including that coat, the coat of many colors. Not only that, but as Jacob made all his other sons go out to work with the sheep out in the fields, he seemed to tolerate it when Joseph would stay home in the tent and just sort of lounge around. And Joseph knew that he was the favorite. This is classic. Do we have any youngest child people in the house? This is classic youngest child behavior right here. I can tell you, as the oldest child in my family. Sometimes it's good to be the baby in the family and to be the one who gets to talk up to the older brothers and sisters. Joseph knew he was the favorite, so he'd go out of his way to taunt his brothers with his dreams. Now, Joseph's brothers became so angry about this that they tried to murder him by throwing him into a pit. But if they'd ever been brought to trial, they wouldn't have needed Johnny Cochran to get them off, because not only did Joseph have these offensive dreams in which he was Mr. Big and they were all groveling to him, but he'd share those dreams at the breakfast table, recounting them in sickening detail. And since he was already his father's pet, his brothers began to see the sight of him. He'd waltz about in his many-colored coat, flaunting it, while they were stuck out in the bush working. He was filled with pride. So they tossed him into this pit. And as they were trying to figure out what exactly they should do with him, making decisions like, maybe we can dip his clothes in sheep's or goat's blood so that our father will think that he's been killed by a wild animal. And as they were plotting like this, some traveling salespeople were passing by who were on their way to Egypt, and so they thought, well, maybe the best plan is just to sell him, and we'll be rid of him forever. And so he wound up working in servitude in Egypt. The brothers were only too happy to sell their brother into slavery. It seemed like a fitting end for this young Joseph who thought that he would be ruler over all of them, to be a servant permanently instead. And so he wound up working in servitude in Egypt. There were ups and downs and successes and near catastrophes for Joseph along the way. But all along, he kept on dreaming, and God seemed to have a special message in all of those dreams. Well, one day while Joseph was in Egypt serving as a slave, the Pharaoh got wind of the fact that this Hebrew house slave who lived in his kingdom named Joseph was a dreamer, and he could also interpret dreams. And so he called for Joseph because, as it turns out, the Pharaoh had been having some rather troubling dreams of his own, and he wanted to know what they meant. And in fact, Joseph's interpretation turned out to be pretty accurate. He was able to save Egypt from suffering through a terrible famine by predicting it so that they could start storing up food. And so the Pharaoh saw that he could trust Joseph, and before you know it, he's elevated Joseph from being a slave and a servant to being this very high public official, but sort of a secretary of agriculture for the land of Egypt. And that's where the story comes full circle. You see, the famine that Joseph predicted had affected the whole region, including the areas to the north where Joseph's brothers lived. And they'd probably long forgotten about it. But they were feeling the pinch of the famine as well, and they had nothing. But they knew that in Egypt things were better. So they traveled there hoping for food or assistance, and wouldn't you know it, Joseph, who had by now become this powerful person, was the person they had to see about food assistance. Things really had come full circle. Turns out his dreams were true. And yet, all the pride that he felt as a young man, well, he'd sort of grown past that. Now, he could have gloated to his brothers that look at the sheaves coming to bow and grovel to me. He could have done that. He could have had them hanged. He had that kind of power, and they had sold him into slavery. They had done some pretty rotten things to him. And he does sort of toy with them a little bit. And we don't have time to get into those details. But along the way, Joseph had grown. He'd become a new person. Through all of these hardships and high points, he'd grown. And I think it's safe to say that God had helped Joseph to grow. I hope he did, at least. I mean, he really was a bit of a twerp in his youth. So I hope God helped Joseph to grow. Let's face it, there's a little bit of Joseph in all of us. Now, maybe we can't interpret dreams, but God gives all of us gifts and insights. We're all good at something. Yet in our pride, we start to think sometimes that we're special because of that. Better and more deserving. But then God demands that we grow. He puts this little speed bump. Maybe in Joseph's case it was a big speed bump. But he'll put a speed bump that forces us to wake up and re-examine. I'm thankful because God was able to help Joseph to grow by challenging him. And then I'm going to call some of the youth up to share about a little speed bump that God put in their path this weekend to help them to grow. And that was the 30-hour famine. Around hour 6, you're pretty hungry, because that's when you're supposed to eat dinner. And your body knows it's dinner time. And then in the mornings, you wake up, and it's breakfast time. There's no breakfast. Now, we didn't do this just to be sadistic, but rather to help the youth to grow, to understand. And by the way, this was 30-hour famine weekend across the country. Over 100,000 students from all different churches did this. 26 of us here in Amarillo, 26 youth plus adults here in Amarillo, but hundreds of thousands of students all over the country. And we did this to point out the fact that it wasn't, for a lot of kids around the world, it wasn't 30-hour famine Sunday, or 30-hour famine Friday and Saturday. It was just Friday and Saturday. And Sunday would be pretty much like Friday and Saturday, and Thursday had been pretty much like that as well. This is just reality for some people, and it's good when God puts a speed bump in our way to help us to grow and understand that, and maybe grow a little bit more passionate about the needs of others. But I think I've talked enough about it, so I'd like